At the end of the 19th century, a small group of American artists revitalized the American painting tradition. They painted a world that was both real and ideal. Lyrically and naturally, they painted in open air. For the artists of the Hudson River School, nature possessed a vast and godlike beauty. They were in their prime in the 1850s, when most of the artists later to be associated with Impressionism were born. The American Impressionists came of age as the frontiers were being tamed. While the older generation looked west toward the infinite horizon, the younger artists looked back across the Atlantic toward European culture and civilization.
The Impressionist movement in American art, like most movements before and after it.
John I.H. Bauer is a senior scholar of American art.
The people that we are talking about principally today were the pioneers of the American Impressionist movement. People like Twachtman and Hassan and Weir and Robinson and Cassatt were the leaders. They were important because they showed the way. They showed a new approach to nature, a new technical approach at least, that opened up possibilities for color, for exploration of visual effects that other painters then followed and developed in their own particular way. And the movement was like a prairie fire. It started with a small blaze and it spread with remarkable rapidity.
In the 1870s and 1880s, a wave of young American students, lacking good schools and museums at home, went to Europe in search of the highest art and the best teachers they could find. Some went first to Munich, like John Twachtman and William Merritt Chase. Sooner or later, they all went to Paris, like Thomas Dewing, Theodore Robinson, and Childe Hassam. By far the most popular school was the independent Académie Julian in Paris, where the Americans studied traditional painting and drawing in a less formal atmosphere than at the official École des Beaux-Arts. The academies and the French Salon dominated the art of Paris. Historical and poetic subjects, painted with technical perfection, were prized. But finally, to many Americans, the official art was too distant from reality and constrained by too many rules. In the streets of Paris, in the cafes and small galleries, a few Americans were attracted to the pure color and independent spirit of the Impressionists. Impressionists painted subjects that were nearby and familiar. Most often, they painted out of doors where they could see and feel the actual texture of reality, its transparency and mood. For many Americans, the central figure and driving force of Impressionism was Claude Monet. Theodore Robinson was among the first Americans to visit Monet at his home in the village of Giverny, northwest of Paris. By 1888, he was deeply influenced by Monet's painting. Using Monet's technique of broken patches of vibrant color, Robinson labored to adapt Impressionism to his own personal vision. For the next 20 years, Giverny was virtually invaded by American artists. Willard Metcalf, not yet a confirmed Impressionist, painted the village and a typical scene at the hotel. Robinson at breakfast, along with visitors, including John Twachtman,
At the time
John
when
Bauer.
I first started doing research on Robinson, I knew he had been using photographs, And I went to the hotel and I said, do you have anything by Mr. Robinson? And they said, oh, yes, he left a box of things here 50 years ago, and we're still holding them for him. Hard to imagine an American hotel doing a similar thing. And I don't know why Robinson first started to use photography. He began to feel towards the end of his life that he was using it too much. He used it, I think, primarily because he was terribly poor and he could not afford models. He seldom used photographs when he was painting pure landscape. He used it almost entirely when he had figures in his composition, and he used it to save the cost of asking people to pose for him by the hour.
Conversion to the Impressionist style came to the Americans in different ways and varying degrees. Childe Hassam, whose name would be most closely identified with the American Impressionists, had already learned his art in Boston. He was visiting Europe for the second time to paint and study in Paris. He happened to move into an apartment recently abandoned by Auguste Renoir. In later life, Hassam recalled,
I did not know Renoir, and I did not care anything about Renoir, but I looked at these experiments in pure color and saw it was what I was trying to do myself.
Hassam's painting Jeu de Grand Prix won a gold medal at the French Salon of 1889. Although he had the least personal contact with the French Impressionists, Childe Hassam would be their most faithful American devotee. John Singer Sargent was a model of success for many of his countrymen. One of the American expatriates, born in Italy of American parents, Sargent would become the most fashionable portrait painter of his day in England and the United States. But his watercolors and landscapes in oil were created for his own pleasure. Informal scenes gathered from his travels, freely and brightly painted from nature, revealed his affinity with the Impressionists. Sargent would enjoy a long and distinguished career, painting in the soft light and cultivated landscape of Southern Europe. The question for the Americans who began returning home was this: could they use similar techniques in a different light in their own land? An hour north of New York City was the old fishing community of Cos Cob, Connecticut. In 1890, John Twachtman and his friends founded an art school and colony revolving around a merry old boarding house near the train station. The Bush Holly House, now one of America's most historic buildings, is the setting for this discussion on the American phase of Impressionism.
They centered in New England, where there was a strong tradition in history, American history, and in painting. Really.
Donald McClelland is coordinator of an exhibition of American Impressionists for the Smithsonian Institution.
Why did they cluster here? And was it the intimate aspect of the environment?
They didn't paint the Bowery.
No.
But they,
They painted the parks.
they painted the parks.
John Bauer, Director Emeritus of the Whitney Museum.
Yep.
This isn't grandiose and
Yeah.
filled with sublimity. This was much more intimate.
Yeah.
Barbara Novak, Professor of American Art at Barnard College, Columbia University.
And it's decidedly a French.
Adlin Brieskin, Senior Curatorial Advisor at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American Art.
One of the things that's always intrigued me so much is that they were able to pick the same little spot and paint it so many different times and in different
Jeffrey
lights
Anderson,
and different
Director of the
seasons,
Lyme Historical
and
Society.
come away with greatly different and independent pictures.
But still, there was a... Yes.
Susan Larkin, a writer and specialist on John Twachtman.
But they had an obligation
Yes.
to expand American art and to give it the kind of sophistication they wanted it to
Yes.
have, which they felt they could get abroad. But they certainly didn't want to turn
The
their back on
direction.
it.
No, they didn't turn their back. In fact, they pushed it.
I think a good example of what Barbara's just said is John Twachtman, who studied in Munich and studied in Paris and traveled and painted all over Europe, and then came home and walked over his farmland and what was to become his farmland and said, "This is it." like Monet, he was very house-proud and an ardent amateur gardener. So he gardened, he added to the stone walls that were already there, and he painted his garden and his house. But the brook and the waterfall appealed to him most. Twachtman is my favorite because he is, I believe, the most individual of the group. He didn't use broken color as Hassam did so well and as the others did to a lesser extent, but he brought his own feeling of the poetry of a scene. He was always a painter's painter. Even though the public did not admire his work during his lifetime, all of the other fine painters did. Robinson and Hassam considered him very much their superior, and so did Weir, his best friend.
Friendships established in Europe deepened professional commitments at home. The artist's struggle for recognition centered in New York City. Many of them taught at the Art Students League and joined numerous clubs and societies. It was a time of great optimism and steady cultural achievement. Recently completed, Central Park opened the city to the pleasures of air and sunlight. The Metropolitan Museum entered its second decade, responding to the public demand for a major museum of art. Was it possible that New York could ever rival Paris? The artist's friend Stanford White created a monument in Washington Square that recalled the Arc de Triomphe. Childe Hassam painted it joyfully, with nostalgia for Paris, but mindful of America's need for symbols of cultural pride. Multimillionaires like Andrew Carnegie and Henry Frick built the last lavish mansions on Fifth Avenue, ultimately to house their collections of European art. The dream of the decade reached its fullest expression in 1893 at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Under this flamboyant neoclassical facade, inspired by the French school of Beaux-Arts architecture, a new century was about to emerge. In the Palace of Fine Arts, the Impressionists were inconspicuous among the 9,000 oil paintings on view. But after strolling through the halls, the novelist and critic Hamlin Garland was prompted to describe the artists working in open air.
The fundamental idea of the Impressionist is that a picture should be a unified impression, not a mosaic, but a complete and momentary concept of the sense of sight. The Impressionists do not paint leaves, they paint the effect of leaves upon the eye.
Some of the Impressionists were beginning to make their mark. Thomas Dewing traveled with his patron, Charles Freer, to Chicago, and Freer began collecting Dewing's characteristic portraits of elegant women in poetic spaces. The so-called New Woman, healthy, independent, and beautiful, was a favorite theme of painters and sculptors of the time. It was a dominant theme in the work of Mary Cassatt. Mary Cassatt was the American most closely associated with the French Impressionists, especially Degas. While living in France most of her life, her paintings and advice to American collectors would have a tremendous impact on the course of American art. Adeline Breeskin.
Mrs. Potter Palmer of Chicago was placed in charge of the woman's building. And they had a woman architect to design the building, and they had asked Mary Cassatt to do one of the 2 murals. She worked hard and then found that they would be skied so terrifically that you'd have to practically sprain your neck to look up and to see them.
What happened to them?
They were lost.
I have tried, she wrote, to express the modern woman in the fashions of our day, and I have tried to represent those fashions as accurately and as much in detail as possible. I took for a subject plucking the fruits of knowledge and science. That enabled me to place my figures out of doors and allowed a brilliancy of color. I have tried to make the general effect as bright, as gay, as amusing as possible. In summertime, the American Impressionists roamed the coast of New England, looking for paintable spots. One of Childe Hassam's favorite places was Appledore, in the Isles of Shoals. Landing for the first time, wrote Celia Thaxter, the stranger is struck by the sadness, the vast loneliness, nothing but sky and sea and rocks. But the very wildness and desolation reveal a strange beauty. Celia Thaxter was the daughter of the lighthouse keeper. She made Appledore a gathering place for writers, artists, and musicians. Celia wrote about her beloved island garden, and Hassam painted. Let him but touch a flower, she wrote, and lo, its soul is his. Now are the crickets loud in the grass, and the hawkweed waves in pale yellow all over the island, but still the garden glows. At the heart of a rugged island, a parlor of flowers. In the midst of rock and wilderness, a garden. Hassam returned to this scene again and again.
I happen to feel that it was, on some levels, a kind of escape to a paradise in the same way that Gauguin went to the South Seas.
Barbara Novak.
That kind of removal was typical of last quarter of the century all over the world as modernism was coming in and modern life was coming in on people. They were looking for ways to find something else, even a corner of nature that they could find joy in. There was this dream going on.
Another haven for the Impressionists was along the coast of Connecticut, where the town of Old Lyme is located at the mouth of the Connecticut River. Like Cascab, it had been a thriving shipbuilding area earlier in the 19th century. Along the river are marshes and quiet coves. In the countryside, rocky ledges are grown over with tall cedars and oaks and interspersed with small farms. And everywhere, the stone fences. All of these subjects were evocative not of progress, but of rural American traditions rooted in New England. The artist frequented one of the boarding houses in Old Lyme. The owner and guiding spirit was Miss Florence Griswold. Under her care, Childe Hassam, Willard Metcalf, and many other artists were able to realize their quest for the ideal summertime sanctuary. Open-air painting was a way of life for these artists. They went out in the morning, carrying easels and sketching boxes, and spent the days painting and having picnics and looking for rustic scenery. Impressionism was a way to lend new vitality to symbols that were rapidly receding into the past. Jeffrey Anderson, director of the Lyme Historical Society.
These artists coming in, as Hassam put it, this little excursion into Bohemia and all the antics that took place here with parades down the main street, all caused the townsfolk to look a little askance at the artists and really wonder what was going on here. But eventually, the artists sort of won over the town, and Florence Griswold was very fond of putting it this way. She said, at first the artist adopted Lyme, then Lyme adopted the artist, And now today, lime and art are synonymous.
In New York City, Childe Hassam helped organize and raised money for an artists' cooperative on West 67th Street, the first of a whole block of studios. They were the least alienated of artists, hobnobbing with their wealthy patrons. In 1897, they withdrew from the Society of American Artists and founded their own exclusive group called the 10 American Painters, photographed here in 1908. The 10 included the Impressionists, Childe Hassam, J. Alden Weir, Thomas Dewing, and Willard Metcalf. But John Twachtman, one of the founders, died in 1902 and has been replaced by William Merritt Chase. Chase was the great teacher. In numbers of students, in lasting influence, in his memorable advice, he was the greatest.
Do not try to paint the grandiose thing. Paint the commonplace so that it will be distinguished.
Chase found his own refuge from New York City on the eastern end of Long Island. At Shinnecock, he opened his school for painting in the open air.
Self-entertainment is what I hope to bring about. Play with your paint. Be happy over it. Sing at your work. The successful painting ought to look as if it has been blown onto the canvas in one puff.
By the end of the first decade of the 20th century, the American Impressionists found their gentle point of view increasingly at odds with the modern world. Other artists, including their own students, made the reality of urban life a blatant theme. This new group of painters called themselves the Eight and were known as the Ashcan School. Two members of the Ashcan School, Ernest Lawson and Maurice Pendergast, were stylistically aligned to the older Impressionists. Ernest Lawson is known for the muted colors and rich texture of his canvases. Maurice Pendergast had studied at the Académie Julian and had visited Giverny a few years after Theodore Robinson. Pendergast created a world of perpetual sunshine and fantasy. In his decorative tapestries of color and design, Pendergast evolved the most distinctive personal style of all the American Impressionists. In his later years, he was considered the old master of American modernists, a tribute to his successful voyage into the New Age. Childe Hassam was one of many shocked by the new abstract painting after 1913.
A picture that does not carry its own message of loveliness, but which requires the services of an artistic guide, is not, to my mind, a work of art.
Yet even Hassam's later series of flag paintings explored the new possibilities of abstract color and pattern. But it was the carefree holiday atmosphere and the spirit of community and tradition that inspired him most. Childe Hassam survived to a distinguished old age, outliving many of his artist friends. he could see the combined effect of their work. Their paintings were now displayed in the Metropolitan and the Smithsonian and in dozens of collections around the country. They were men of culture, devoted to nature, bridging the old and the new, preserving and transforming. They created a foundation for American art and artists to flourish in the 20th century. The question of nature, as Walt Whitman wrote, involves the question of happiness. Happy in their work and harmonious in their lives, Childe Hassam and the American Impressionists tried to make time stand still.